I guess I already had a bit of an introduction, but just a little bit more. I've been gardening here in Torbay since about 2001, and since 2009 I've been at my current home. I started with basically a mixture of gravel and clay, so no, not much potential for a productive garden at first sight. So yeah, at the top there you can see that's how it looked in 2010. So it'd been there a year at that stage, so I'd managed to haul some of the rocks out of the garden. I actually used my truck for hauling some of the rocks out. They were so big. And we added a little bit of compost, and got a few plants going. We got some corn and some squash and some potatoes and some beans there, but they kind of ran out of steam, and we got a few potatoes and I think maybe a couple of squash, but nothing else really did very well. So it was clear that I needed to do a fair amount of work with it. And if you look at the second image there, that's last year. You can see a lot changed. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is soil. Yeah, it took us 9 years of work to build the soil up to a point where we were able to produce some pretty decent crops. So next slide here. Okay. So healthy soil, along with these other factors, is key to healthy plants and a productive garden. As gardeners, it's all too easy to focus on the plants, but to be successful as a gardener, we need to focus on developing and maintaining a healthy soil. Having a healthy soil gives your plants the best possible chance. A healthy soil supports growth by providing nutrients and moisture required by the plants, and by providing a favourable environment for the soil microbes, which break down organic matter in the soil and make it available to your plants. In this webinar, we'll have a look at how to build and maintain a soil that will feed your plants. But first we're going to look at the basics. What is soil? What are the basic components of soil? How different soils are classified. And then we'll look at how we can use this information to better understand our own soil and how to improve it. Once we've established what is a healthy soil, we'll look at how you can maintain that soil and ensure that your crops have the nutrients that they need to flourish. So what is soil? Well, the Encyclopedia Britannica describes soil as the biologically active porous medium that has developed in the uppermost layer of the Earth's crust. Soil is one of the principal substrata of life on Earth, serving as a reservoir of water, nutrients, as a medium for the filtration and breakdown of injurious wastes, and as a participant in the cycling of carbon and other elements through the global ecosystem. It has evolved through through weathering processes driven by biological, climatic, geologic and topographic influences. So from that, it's pretty clear that there's more to soil than meets the eye. So a bit of a warning here. I'm a geologist, so I tend to look at soil from a sort of a geological standpoint, and that'll become obvious in the next few slides. So we know the Earth is composed of spheres. The outermost is the atmosphere. We're all pretty familiar with that. We're breathing it every day. Then there's the hydrosphere, which is all the water on Earth. So oceans, lakes, ponds. A little puddle in your backyard. That's all part of the hydrosphere. Then we have the biosphere, which is all the living things on Earth, all the life, whether it's in the water, on the land, or in the air, in the soil, wherever. And then we have the lithosphere, which is all the rocks. Driving down the highway and you see a road cut, you're looking at the top of the lithosphere. But there's a layer that we don't really hear much about. Come on, next slide. There we go. the pedosphere. Yeah, we rarely hear about that. This is all the soil, and this lies on top of the lithosphere and below the your hydrosphere and your atmosphere and all that. And it's key to all terrestrial life on Earth. Very much overlooked layer. So here's another look at it. Again, I apologize, I'm a geologist. So here we see the pedosphere sitting on top of the lithosphere, the rocks there. And because it's at this interface between these layers, it's actually comprised of parts of all of these layers. So it kind of is a pretty special layer, and that'll become obvious as we go through this presentation. So this is a typical agricultural soil in Newfoundland. You can see there's a thin dark layer, which is the soil where everything's kind of going on, the layer that's been enriched by the agriculture that's going on there. Lots of good stuff has been added to this, and the rocks have been picked out. But then you go down sort of 6 or 8 inches, and you're into this sort of rocky, clay, basically glacial sediments. Been sitting there for the last 8 or 10,000 years after the glaciers receded. So there's 5 key components of a typical soil. These are mineral, organic, water, life, and air. So we're going to have a look at the mineral components first. Typically they're between 45 and 50% of your soil by volume. Obviously that varies. I've seen soil that's probably 100% mineral, and obviously you have other soils that are if you go to a peat bog or something like that, there's no mineral content in that. But on average, you're looking at 45 or 50%. This is composed of your primary minerals, which are your rock fragments, sand and silt. And these are important for water retention and for they sort of regulate the water retention. They allow the soil to drain or not drain depending on how much is there. And they contribute to the soil structure, giving a bit of kind of firmness to the soil. The secondary minerals are the weathered rock fragments. So these are rock fragments that have been hydrated by the water. Actually, over time, water will break down rocks, and it forms a clay. Clay is a mineral. It's kind of made up of like thin plates, and other chemicals and stuff can get between these little thin plates. So soil plays a very important role. Clay plays an important role in your soil chemistry and in nutrient retention and water retention, because water and nutrients get in between these plates, so they don't get washed away when it rains, but they're available there for the plants. So particle size. I already mentioned about we got sand and silt in the rock fragments, but we can classify the mineral component based on the particle size. So we break it down into 3 components. We kind of ignore the big boulders and things like that we pull out of the garden and just focus on the smaller stuff. So sand, rub it between your fingers. It's kind of gritty. Silt feels smooth between your hands, but if you're a geologist and you put dirt in your mouth, you can feel the silt scrunching between your teeth. Clay is really, really fine grained. It feels smooth and sticky in your hands, and even feels smooth on your teeth. And then you spit it out. So the mineral components are what determines the texture of your soil. This is a diagram that we use for classifying soils based on the relative proportions of the different mineral components. So I don't know if you can see my pointer here or not, but if you look on the diagram there, I've outlined the top of it, which is the clay area, and if you look on the left of the triangle, You can see the numbers going up from 10 to 100. That's the percentage clay. So if we have anything that's more than 50 or 60% clay, that's referred to as a clay soil. And a clay soil is typically it's a heavy soil. It's slow to drain because the clay kind of blocks the water from moving down through it. It's very sticky when it's wet. It packs hard because the clay is kind of slippery and it's easy to kind of squeeze all the air out of it. It packs solid. When it does dry out, it's pretty much waterproof. You can water it all you want and the water just runs off. And you'll see it cracks in dry spells because the water that was between those platy clay minerals, when that disappears, the clay actually shrinks. Now if we look at the bottom of the triangle here, we're looking at sands and silts. So this soil would be soil in this area of the diagram would be very low in clay. It's often referred to as a light soil. These soils are quick draining because you don't have the clay there that's kind of blocking the water from moving through it. They're crumbly even when they're wet. You can kind of pick them up and they crumble in your hands. They don't tend to pack and they'll dry very fast. So you could have a big heavy rainstorm, and 2 days later you'd be out there watering it. So the ideal garden soil, you don't want too much clay, obviously, because you don't want it to be holding water and staying wet forever. So the ideal garden soil is described as a sandy loam, which you see outlined in the bottom left-hand corner of the diagram there. So it's mostly sand, a little bit of silt, and it can have a little bit of clay. Most times you're not going to find that that's the soil you have in your garden, but knowing what kind of soil you have, you can adjust your soil over time to kind of move it in the direction towards being a sandy loam. Okay, so the next component is water. That can comprise between 2 and 50% by volume. Some of that water is actually water like you pick up the soil and you squeeze it and you might get drips of water coming out. But some of that water is actually bound up in these clay minerals and you'd have to bake it in an oven to actually get it out. Water is important for transporting nutrients to your plants and the soil organisms. And it's also important in the biological and chemical decomposition of organic matter in your soil. The ability of soil to retain water is controlled by its texture and the organic content. Excuse me a second, I'm just going to have a drink of my cup of tea here. All right. So now the organic component, that can be anywhere between 0, which is what I started out with in my garden, 0% up to about 50% by volume. If you look at it by weight, I think it's usually between like maybe 5 and 15%, something like that, because organic matter is primarily carbon, which is fairly light once you've once all the water's gone out of it. So your organic component consists of basically dead stuff, dead plant or animal matter. It's important because it retains and provides nutrients and water to your plants. It contributes to a good soil structure, so the particles of organic matter will get in between the particles of clay and the other minerals and stop them sticking together, so that when you squish it in your hand or when you're treading on it or something like that, it actually rebounds a bit. Or the organic material can enhance the growth potential of poor soils. So as you saw in the first picture I showed, my garden back in 2009, it was all gravel and stuff, but I added what compost that I had and actually grew some plants. They didn't do very well, but there was enough organic matter there to allow them to grow. A high organic content is a good indicator of a productive soil. So if you see a soil that's nice and dark and rich looking, it's it's likely that's going to be a productive soil. Whereas if you see something that's all kind of rocks and clay, probably that's not going to be a good soil for growing stuff in. And air or gases, that's another vital component of your soil. Basically, any spaces between the particles that are not filled by water are going to be filled by air. Oxygen is essential for the roots and microbe health in your soil. They need to be able to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide just like we do breathing. So if there's no airspace in the soil for them to exchange those gases, eventually they're just going to keel over and die. This happens when you have waterlogged soil. The plants can no longer exchange gases, and the roots will just suffocate and die and then rot. Carbon dioxide and nitrogen are also essential for the below ground plant functions, particularly for nitrogen fixing bacteria in the nodules on leguminous plants. We'll have a look at those a bit later as well. And of course the life component makes up less than 1% of your soil by volume, but in a single tablespoon of good garden soil there's over 20,000 microorganisms. So it's a pretty busy place. So the life component consists of we're all familiar with earthworms, and then there's nematodes, which if you did biology in school you might have seen nematodes. Bacteria, not all bacteria are bad. There's a lot of very beneficial bacteria that without them life on Earth wouldn't be possible. And then we've got algae and fungi, and there's a whole long list of other living things in your soil, but I was trying to keep it relatively short. These are the primary decomposers of organic matter. So they'll take the dead stuff in the soil and they'll break it down into humus, which is a sort of that's the sort of brown nutrient stuff in the soil that is actually plant available nutrients. Obviously if you just got dead stuff in the soil, the plants can't do anything with it. It actually has to be broken down into components that the plants can absorb. So continuing on a little bit with the life component, I mentioned a little bit about the nitrogen fixing bacteria. These actually live in little nodules on particularly your pea plants, bean plants, and lupins and a few other things. So it's a symbiotic relationship. The plant gives the bacteria some sugars, and the bacteria actually absorbs nitrogen from the atmosphere and then converts it to a soluble nitrogen that the plants can actually absorb. And then we have mycorrhizae, which are little tiny fungal strands that exist in the soil. And these actually form a symbiotic relationship with plants. They're very important in like the boreal forest. Boreal forest probably couldn't grow without the mycorrhizal relationships. But they're also important in gardens too. These little strands of fungi will attach themselves to the roots of the plants and form a symbiotic relationship. The plant gives the fungi a little bit of sugar, and the fungi goes out into the soil and absorbs water and nutrients from the soil that otherwise wouldn't be available to the plant. And then there's mycorrhizal networks. These are kind of interesting. I don't have, they're kind of beyond the scope of this presentation, but they're kind of interesting. So you have your mycorrhizae, and then connecting to the plants, but then they can actually connect to multiple plants. So you actually have a network of this mycorrhizae and the plants, and it's it's early days on the research for this, but it's a possible mechanism for exchange of nutrients between plants, and also it may facilitate communication or exchange of information between plants. So if you have one plant in a field that's getting attacked by aphids or something, it's going to be releasing chemicals to try and deter these aphids, and that message could actually get passed on to other plants that are connected to this mycorrhizal network, and they'll start defending themselves against aphids before the aphids even attack. Okay, so beyond the sort of physical components of the soil, there's other important factors. Soil pH is a measure of the acidity of your soil. pH influences the nutrient availability. Some nutrients are soluble at different pHs, so you want to have an optimal pH where the nutrients that you need are going to be soluble in the right amounts. pH influences the breakdown of organic matter. We've probably all heard of things being preserved in peat bogs, and that's because peat is very acidic, and things just don't break down. The typical range in a soil is 4.5 to 8.5. In an ideal garden soil, you want it somewhere between 6.2 and 8.2, so just slightly on the acidic side. Different crops do require different pHs. Like if you're growing brassicas, so your cabbage and kale and broccoli and that kind of thing, you want a slightly higher pH, so a little bit more alkaline. Whereas if you're growing potatoes or something, you might want it slightly more acidic. The pH is easily measured with these little test kits. You just take a little sample of soil, put it in the vial and shake it up, and let it settle out, and then you read the colour off of the card, and that gives you the pH. So, carbon-nitrogen ratio. This describes the balance of carbon and nitrogen in soil. The ideal ratio for a garden soil is around about 24 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. This provides optimal conditions for your soil microbes, and it enhances the release of nutrients. If you have excess carbon, nitrogen actually gets consumed by the bacteria as they're breaking down this excess carbon, and it leaves your soil deficient in nitrogen. Your plants will struggle to grow. They'll have yellow leaves and diminished yields. Excess nitrogen can be just as much of a problem. Your plants will look wonderful, lots of leafy growth, but they put all their, they focus all their efforts onto the leaves, and you end up with diminished yields of fruit. And there's also the hazard of causing environmental damage. If you have excess nitrogen in your soil, a lot of it will just end up getting washed out into the nearest brook or pond or whatever, and that contributes to algal blooms, which are bad for the ecosystem, poisoning fish and that kind of thing. And because we're often paying money for nitrogen, whether it's fertilizer or manure, there's a financial cost as well. So try and avoid having excess nitrogen. So, in a new housing development, oftentimes the soil is stripped off prior to construction, leaving building lots as barren piles of glacial till. Not an ideal soil, but potentially it is a starting point to build a good soil. This is my property back in 2010. So you can see in the foreground there all the rocks that we pulled out, and then my first stab at having a garden. In other areas, like if you're somewhere more rural, you might find that you have 100% organic soil. This here is a peat bog in Port aux Basques, but a lot of Newfoundland is covered with this kind of soil, whether it's in a peat bog or in a woodland setting. You could have 100% organic soil. It's typically very acidic and nutrient poor. But again, it can be improved by adding some mineral component and nutrients, and you can have quite a productive soil. So now that we've got a bit of background on what soil is and the components, let's have a look at how we actually build a healthy soil, so we can go from this to, come on, this. This is my garden last year. So the first step is observation. Get down on your hands and knees, get your hands dirty and have a look at what you've actually got. Feel the soil, squish it in your hands, smell the soil, and if you're a geologist, put some in your mouth and see what it feels like on your teeth. Your route to a healthy soil may be different depending on what you're starting with. This is how my soil looked in 2009. After the contractor had used all the topsoil that I had them set aside, he used all that to backfill around the house. So all the good soil is now up against my basement wall, and the garden is, well, back in 2009, the garden was all this silt and clay. So getting to know your soil. Alright, so I'll just go back to the previous slide. If it'll let me go back. Oh, that was going to go back too far. Okay, there we go. Right. Press the button once, we're all good. Okay. So on the image on the right there, you can see that's kind of a zoomed in, the one on the left. So you can see there's there's a few sort of chunky bits, grains of sand, and then there's some finer silty stuff, but there's a lot of clay in there. So when I squish it in my hand, you can see on the left there, when I squished it, some of it actually oozed out around my thumb. So that's an indication that it's pretty clay. And then on the right, what I did was I pushed my thumb into it to see if it would kind of crumble apart, and it didn't. It just left the sort of indentation of my thumb. So this soil is pretty high in clay. So going back to our trusty little soil texture diagram, I reckon this soil is about 80% clay, 10% sand, and 10% silt. So that puts me right up in the top corner there, firmly in the clay zone. So this, clay, we discussed, it's kind of a building block, one of the building blocks of a good soil, but in and of itself, it's not a good soil. So to improve this soil, it's going to take a fair amount of work. I want to bring it down from clay down into that sandy loam area. One way to do this would be by adding sand, and you can see that arrow there, the yellow arrow indicates the sort of adding sand. That moves me from the clay area towards the 100% sand. And to improve it further, bring it into the middle of that sandy loam area, I could add a little bit of silt. What I actually did was added my own screened topsoil, which was probably an even sort of sand-silt mix. So we're going to have a look at that now. Here we go. This is my soil just a few days ago. I went out and found some that wasn't under snow still, and yeah, this is it here. So I added my screened topsoil, and I also added organic matter. We've not really talked about the organic matter yet. We're just focusing on the mineral component at this stage. We'll have a look at the organic matter later. But yeah, it contains a fair amount of sand and silt. Now you can see on the image on the right there's some sand grains. You can't really see the silt, but it's there. And now if I squish it in my hand, it does kind of still hold its shape, but there is a little bit of springiness to it. And when I push my thumb into that lump, it does actually crumble a bit, which is encouraging. So I estimate now the mineral components to be roughly equal parts of sand, silt, and clay. So if we say like 33% of each, that puts me bang in the middle of the diagram in the clay loam area. So you can see, by adding equal parts of sand and silt, that brought me kind of straight down the middle from the clay into that clay loam, which is a much better place to be. So my target texture is there, so I still have some improvement to do. I can add more sand, and that will bring me over into the sandy loam area. So that's something I will be doing over time. For established beds like I have, you can add a little each year. You can use sand even as a mulch, to kind of suppress weeds we'll talk about that a bit later as well. But for new beds, you can use this information to calculate how much sand you're actually going to need to bring your soil into your sandy loam kind of region. So if I was building new beds here, for each 100 kilograms of clay loam, by my calculations, I'm not a mathematician, but by my calculations, I reckon that I need about 40 kilos of sand for each 100 kilo of the soil to bring me into the sandy loam region. That sounds like an awful lot of sand, but remember, sand is quite dense compared to your soil, so volume-wise, it's actually a fairly small amount. So a mixture of sand, silt, and clay makes wonderful bricks. But we need something to stop it sticking together, and that's where the organic matter comes in, or dead stuff, basically. Organic matter is basically any dead stuff, plant or animal, fungus, anything like that that's in your soil. It provides much of the nutrients needed by the plants, but also helps improve the soil structure by stopping the mineral particles from sticking together and giving the soil a more crumbly and sort of springy texture. So again, I'm just going to have a quick look at some different soils here to get an estimate of what the organic component is. It can be determined. You can determine the organic component by in a lab by heating the sample up to 105 degrees Celsius to drive off all the water. Then you weigh the sample. Then you cook it up to 400 degrees Celsius to burn off all the organic matter. And then you weigh it again, and the difference in the weight is due to the organic matter that's been lost. Alternatively, you can get your hands dirty and eyeball it. That's kind of my preferred method. It's just a small garden. It's not a big farm, so that's what I'm going with. If I had a couple of 100 acres, then definitely I'd get it looked at in a lab. But for my garden, it's not really cost effective. The soil that we see here, this again is what the soil was like in the beginning in my garden. It's very sticky. It compacts easily and doesn't really spring back at all. It's fairly light in color, meaning that it's not sort of like brown or black. It's a lighter color. So this is a pretty good indication that it's got a very low organic content. This is the soil in my actual garden now. After 9 years of work, it's crumbly. It compacts easily, but it has a little bit of springiness to it. It kind of rebounds. Sort of a light brown in color, so that's an indication that there's a moderate amount of organic matter in there. And then if we look at a woodland soil, this is really spongy. It doesn't compact, you can squish it and it springs right back to its original shape. It's dark brown in color, and you can be pretty sure that that's got a high organic content. You can see the roots and dead moss and all that kind of stuff in there. So that's an organic soil. So we know what we have, and we know what constitutes an ideal garden soil. Sandy loam texture, the organic content 20 to 50% by volume, or 5 to 15 by weight. Your carbon nitrogen ratio about 24 to 1. And soil pH in the 6.2 to 6.8 range. So now we have to decide how we're going to get from what we've got to what we actually want. So, decision time. Do we try and build a soil using what we have? Maybe bring in some components, or do we just buy ready-made soil? Every situation is different. I ended up doing a bit of both with my soil, making soil for my first few beds, and then importing soil when I ran out of the ingredients. Initially, I was hesitant to bring in any soil or any components, because whenever you bring anything into your garden, you always got a chance of bringing in weeds. So let's have a look at my table here. Building your own soil can be cost effective if you have access to the components. Like in my garden, I had an area that was kind of a silty sand, which I was able to dig up and screen and mix into my soil. Building your own soil avoids bringing in new weeds, especially if you're on like a new building lot or a new bit of ground somewhere. You may have very few weeds, which is really nice. Building soil does require some equipment, like you're going to need a screen and other tools like that. Buying in soil, you have instant results. You tip it into the bed and firm it down a little bit, and you can start planting. But you're likely to be bringing in weed seeds in the soil, and then these weeds will germinate. And because the soil you're buying in is a nice rich soil, they'll take off like wildfire and be competing with the seeds that you've just sown. Another advantage is there's no additional equipment required other than maybe a wheelbarrow and a shovel. So since this webinar is about building a soil, we're going to explore that option here. So we can start by adjusting the soil texture to reach the ideal sandy loam region. This can be achieved in most situations by adding sand, either in the form of a sandy topsoil or a clean sand that doesn't have too much clay in it. So we want to look. Then we want to look at the organic components. So we know we want between 20 and 50% by volume, but it's important to pay attention to your carbon and nitrogen ratios. You don't want to go too far in one direction or the other. So I once heard it said that Newfoundland has perfect soil. It's just that its components are not all in the same place. We're lucky that we do have relatively easy access to many good sources of organic matter. And I'm just going to run through a few here, but it's important to pay attention to your carbon-nitrogen ratios. If you look online, there's lots of you can find lots of tables that have carbon-nitrogen ratios. If you look on websites about composting and that kind of stuff, I'm not going to go big into composting in this presentation because it's taken me long enough to go through all the soil stuff. But there's lots of good stuff online about it. So yeah, seaweed, that's one you hear a lot about here. People going out to get their kelp for their garden. Is excellent for building soil. Normally I would actually either use that as a mulch or I'd dig it in trenches in the garden. Then you got leaves. Yeah, another excellent source of organic matter, much higher in carbon. If you look at the numbers there, you can see like 24 is the number that we kind of want to have in our garden as our ideal carbon-nitrogen ratio. Anything that's lower than 24 to 1, that's going to be high in nitrogen. Anything that's higher than 24 to 1 is high in carbon. So you can see the leaves there, they're high in carbon. The kelp is higher in nitrogen, compared to your 24 ideal. Yeah, using manure. Manure is an excellent source of both your nitrogen and organic matter, but be sure that it's well rotted, or add it to a compost instead of directly to your garden. Sawdust and wood chips, an excellent source of carbon, but if not balanced with nitrogen, they'll absorb all the nitrogen out of your soil, leaving your soil kind of depleted and dead. So either, if you're mulching with them, it's best to use like weathered sawdust that's been sitting around for a couple of years and add some extra nitrogen just to kind of balance it out, or use nitrogen in your compost, which then after it's composted for a few years, you can add that to your garden. Good compost is an excellent thing to add to your garden. It's pretty close to perfect in your carbon-nitrogen ratio. That can go directly in your garden. It's a great source of nutrients and of soil microbes. Well-rotted horse manure is an excellent source of organic matter and nitrogen. You can see that's 25 to 1. That's pretty much bang on what you want in your soil. So if you just had a pile of horse manure that was well rotted, go to town, put that straight in your mineral soil and mix it in. So once we've managed to establish a healthy soil, that's going to keep things growing and stuff for your first few years. But over time, the soil is actually going to it'll change over time. So we like to say, if you look after the soil is going to look after your plants. So soil is a kind of a dynamic ecosystem. It's always changing because there's active things going on with the things that we're growing in it and the things that are living in it. Nutrients are used up by crops or used up by the weeds. Some nutrients are lost to the atmosphere. The carbon in your soil will actually react with oxygen, forming carbon dioxide, and then that leaves your soil. It's also consumed by the soil bacteria. Nutrients can be washed out by water. So instead of being in your garden, it's in the nearest brook. We need to maintain a good nutrient levels for healthy and productive soil. So a little bit more about the nutrients. There's kind of three groups. There's your macronutrients, the secondary nutrients, and the micronutrients. The macronutrients are the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and these are the ones that you see listed on bags of fertilizer. Like if you see 6-8-12 or 20-20-20, that's referring to your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. These are all very important to plant health. The nitrogen is responsible for kind of all the green growth that you see. Phosphorus is important for the roots and flowers, and potassium is important for overall plant health. These are involved in so many different systems and reactions and things going on in the plant, but this is a kind of a very brief summary of what those different elements do. Secondary nutrients, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. You'll often hear people talking about calcium and magnesium deficiency in plants. So it's important that you're able to provide these nutrients. And then there's the micronutrients. These are only required in very, very small, parts per million kind of amounts, but some of them are essential to plant growth. Other ones are important for some plants, not for others, and other ones are ones that can actually substitute for different minerals. But they're all good to have in small amounts. So how do we ensure that our soil has all these nutrients? Well, you can watch for signs of nutrient deficiency in your plants, but really by the time you get to that stage, leaves are turning yellow or you're getting blossom end rot on your tomatoes, it's kind of too late. So we want to make sure that we keep the soil well fed, and a well fed soil will just look after your plants. So you want to be adding nutrient rich material on a regular basis to kind of maintain that level of nutrients. So how do we add that? Well, compost can be made from almost any organic matter, and it's a valuable source of organic matter and nutrients and soil bacteria. It can be used as a mulch, spread a couple of inches deep on the surface, or it can be tilled in. You can use a municipal compost where that's available. I'm not sure if that's available here yet or not. It's really something that should be if it isn't. You can use a homemade compost, which I guess it sounds like you're doing in the CBS community garden there. Or you can use locally sourced compost. So Carews, they have a compost, and there's other places I think where you can get composts made from composted fish waste and that kind of thing. The bagged compost that you see in the big box stores is often poor quality. I've made the mistake of buying stuff like, when it was on cheap. Open up the bag and it's not a lot more than just wood chips and gravel, maybe a little bit of peat to kind of make it look black. But it was a waste of money, even if it was 50 cents a bag. Manure is another excellent source of organic matter, nutrients, particularly nitrogen and your soil bacteria. It's often available from farms, sometimes for free. It's best to make sure that you get well-rotted manure. If you're getting it from a farm, kind of a hot tip is to go to the back of the manure pile. That'll be the oldest stuff. You can usually see where they've been dumping the new stuff because it's kind of all fresh, and the straw or the wood shavings are all nice and sort of yellow or white, and then you go to the back and it's much more kind of grey. But if you dig into it, you'll find some nice well-rotted manure. Again, the bag manure that you get in the big box stores is often pretty poor quality. There might be some manure in it, but it's often mixed with other stuff. Cheaper peat or wood chips or whatever, and it's kind of expensive, for the volume that you're getting. And of course, there's kelp or seaweed. Kelp is a powerhouse for micronutrients. Because it grows in the ocean, there's a lot of different nutrients that are, readily available in seawater that you often end up being deficient in on land, because all the minerals in the ocean once came from the land, so leached out of the land and they're in the ocean. So harvesting kelp is one way to bring these nutrients back to the land. It's also a good source of nitrogen and organic matter. Fresh kelp can be used as a mulch, spread a couple of inches deep on the surface, or you can bury it in trenches in your ground, and then you can plant above those trenches. Don't attempt to till kelp. You'll spend the rest of your day unwrapping it from the tines of the tiller. Been there, done that. You can also get kelp meal, liquid kelp, and composted kelp. Those are also great sources of micronutrients. So mulching or tilling in of nutrient-rich organic matter is often sufficient to keep the soil healthy and productive, but it's often necessary to add more specific nutrients, especially if you're growing more demanding crops. So this is a look at some soil amendments. I'll just go through them quickly here. There's green sand, which is considered more of a soil conditioner than a nutrient. It contains some minerals that will actually help hold on to the nutrients and then release them in a form that the plants can access. Potassium sulfate gives you your potassium and your sulfur. Kelp, lots of organic matter, and like we said, it's a powerhouse for micronutrients. Chicken manure, you can buy bags of pelleted chicken manure. That's a good source of organic matter and your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Lime is what you normally use to raise the pH of your soil. So if you're planting brassicas or something like that, or your soil is a bit on the acidic side, you can throw on a bit of lime. There's usually a guide on the back of the bag that kind of tells you how much per acre or whatever you should be applying. And then Calphos, that provides calcium and phosphorus. Soil testing can be helpful in determining the quantities of each of these amendments or nutrients that is required. These tests can be performed at the agricultural building on Brookfield Road. You basically just give them a soil sample, and there's a form you have to fill out as well. You give them a list of the plants that you plan to grow, and then they'll tell you the nutrients that are present in your soil and what you need to add in order to grow the crops that you want to grow. Many farms do this on a yearly basis, but for a community garden or a backyard garden, this is probably kind of excessive, because the tests are they cost money, like $20 for for home gardener. So maybe do a test like every 5 years or so. That should be sufficient to kind of keep you on track, like let you know where you are nutrient wise. I did a test on my garden a couple of years ago, and I sort of sampled each of the beds and just gave them a list of everything that I ever planned to grow, and they gave me a report that tells me exactly what I need for each of those crops. And I'm sort of assuming that my nutrient levels are not going to shift too much in the next few years, but I'll do a test in 3 or 4 years time probably. So moving on, another way of adding nutrients to your soil is actually in a liquid form. So it can be compost tea, manure tea, or I've heard it called chicken poop soup. Sounds delicious. It's a fairly simple to make. You just need a mesh bag of compost or manure suspended in a bucket of water. Then you use an aquarium bubbler to keep it aerated. If you don't aerate it, it just ends up being a stinking mess. There's other additives that can go into it as well. You can use like liquid kelp, worm castings, comfrey juice or nettle juice. Comfrey, well, I think most people probably know what nettles are, stinging nettles. Comfrey is a plant that has deep roots, and it's what is it, a dynamic accumulator or something like that in the sort of permaculture terms, but it absorbs a lot of nutrients from the soil. So you can take the leaves from comfrey or from nettles and kind of chop them up and let them steep away in a sealed bucket, and they produce a juice that you can pour off, and that's really high in nutrients. So that's a good thing to add to a compost tea. People also put molasses in. That's a bit of an added boost for the bacteria that are in there. So once you've done all that, you kind of let it brew away for a while, and it produces a blend of nutrients and bacteria that can be diluted and applied either directly to the leaves of the plant, so they can actually absorb it through their leaves, or under the soil. And this is a good way to add nutrients throughout the season. So if you're a bit worried about your soil, you might not have the nutrients that you think you need, you can give them a little serving of compost tea once a week throughout the season, and that can kind of help keep those nutrient and soil bacteria levels going through a summer. Another approach to keeping your soil healthy is to use a crop rotation. Growing the same crop in the same garden year after year, season after season, will deplete the soil in the specific nutrients that are required by that plant. And over time, you'll see your yields are decreasing. You also get a buildup of diseases that are specific to that plant. The diseases will overwinter in the soil. Then you plant the same plants there again, and the fungus or the whatever's predating on your plants wakes up, and boom, there's its lunch right there in front of it. So crop rotation is a practice of growing crops with different nutrient requirements in different plots season to season. I've seen rotations that are as short as 2 years and as long as 10. So a rotation plan may also include a fallow year where the ground is left not bare. You plant a cover crop which protects the soil, stops weeds getting established, prevents erosion, and it builds nutrients and organic matter into your soil. And then the following season you'd mow that down and till it in. So let's just have a go through the this rotation plan here. This is an example of a 5-year plan. So in the first year we're growing legumes, which is your peas and beans. These are your nitrogen fixers. They have these nitrogen fixing nodules on their roots. You can actually get an inoculant which you can coat the seed with, just to kind of make sure that those bacteria are there right from the start. Then after you harvest your peas and beans, we're going to apply some lime to the soil and a nice layer of mulch. The lime is important here because the following year we're growing our brassicas, which need a slightly higher pH. After the brassicas have been harvested, we're going to apply some sand and a mulch, because in year 3 we're growing parsnips, beets, carrots, root crops, and they like a slightly lighter, sandier soil. After those come out, we apply a nice layer of mulch. This would be a good time to use leaves as a mulch, because the following year, year 4, we're going to be planting garlic, and garlic you actually plant in the fall. So what I would do is I would prepare the ground, plant my garlic, and then lay the mulch, actually, like a inch or two of leaves on top of the garlic, and then the garlic will push up through that the following year. But the weeds are going to struggle. After the garlic come out, or your garlic or leeks or onions, sorry, we apply more mulch, and then the following year could be solanaceae, so your potatoes, tomatoes, and if we live somewhere warmer, peppers and eggplants. You could use a hoop house or something like that to cover a garden and grow peppers and eggplants. So those, your solanaceae, they typically come out fairly early in the season. So at that point, it's a good time to till the garden over and plant a cover crop. Winter rye is kind of a good one. It germinates fast, and it'll protect the soil over the winter. And in the spring, you'd mow it down and till it in, and that gives your ground a nice boost of organic matter. And then you go back to year 1 and cycle on like that. I think it's slow to update here. Okay. So this is a slide I just threw in actually this afternoon. No dig, or minimal tillage, is something that's been around for a long time, but it's gaining a bit of traction more recently. I've been practicing it in my garden for a number of years. In no dig or minimal tillage growing, soil disturbance is kept to a minimum. Nutrients are added by mulching with compost or rotted manure or whatever, and the plants are actually planted into the mulch. So the advantages of this is that it maintains your soil structure, it limits soil compaction, it maintains a natural stratification of soil microbes. So at different levels in the soil, you have different fungi and bacteria. When you till the soil, it kind of mixes them all up, and then they've got to try and re-establish themselves. With no till, you're not mixing it up. It avoids bringing up new weed seeds. So if you've got a problem with weeds, if you till your ground, you mix those seeds around. So you'll mix some down into the soil, and then next time you till it, you'll bring those up to the surface. And as soon as they're near the surface, pop, they germinate, and you got a problem with weeds. So minimal tillage, it does tend to result in fewer weeds, particularly stuff like chickweed, which can be a real problem. And there's less equipment required because you don't need a tiller. Disadvantage, it requires large volumes of mulch, so if you don't have access to that, it can be a bit challenging. Other than that, I can't really think of many disadvantages, particularly in a raised bed kind of scenario. I'm quite keen on no dig in my garden. It seems to be working fairly well. Okay. So another important thing to consider is weed management. Weeds are very fast growing, and they'll rapidly consume the nutrients that are available in your soil. It's kind of their job to, as soon as there's a bit of bare soil, they come in and grow fast and shed lots of seeds. But say that's using up all your nutrients. So you really got to keep on top of weeds. So regular weeding by hand or with a hoe. The best time to hoe your ground is before you can even see the weeds. That means that you're disturbing them just as they're germinating. And if you wait a couple of weeks and you're hoeing things out, they're big enough that they can reroot. But if you hoe when they're just germinating, that kills them and they can't get reestablished. Mulching is another good way to control weeds. You can either use a natural mulch, like we talked about the leaves, but you can also use sawdust or wood chips if you keep in mind your carbon-nitrogen ratios. You can use sand, like if you need to add sand to your soil, you can add it as a mulch, or you can use a synthetic mulch. So that would be Well, there's woven polypropylene is what I use in my garden. It is a plastic. I know we're trying to sort of limit the amount of plastic we use, but this woven polypropylene, if you look after it, it will last decades, and I think it's a pretty responsible use of plastics. I would stay away from the landscape cloth stuff that you can buy, because it tends to disintegrate very rapidly. It's intended to be used underneath a layer of wood chips or stone or something like that. But when it's exposed to the sun and the air, it shreds, and you end up with soil full of little pieces of it. Thermal composting is another way to stay on top of the weeds. If you get compost right, get the carbon nitrogen ratio right, and the water content and everything right, compost heap can actually get up to over 60 degrees Celsius, and this will kill any weed seeds that are in there. And then when you spread this compost on your garden, there's no weeds there that are gonna germinate out of the compost. And cover cropping is another way to keep on top of weeds. After you take your crops out in the fall, sow some winter rye or something like that, and that'll, once that germinates, it kind of inhibits any other weeds from getting established. So, getting towards the end of things now. Here's some take-home points. So, a healthy soil is vital to a productive garden. You can build a soil with good texture and plenty of organic matter. Study your soil and add the components that are necessary. What we said earlier about getting down on your hands and knees, getting dirty, and have a look and a feel, and stick the soil in your mouth, all that good stuff. Get to know your soil, and then you can figure out what you need to do to improve it. Particularly early on in your garden, it's good to test the pH and adjust it as necessary. Once you got it established and lots of organic matter there, it'll drift over time, probably become acidic with the organic matter. So that's why we sort of add lime as well over time. Try and figure ways to maintain your nutrients. So mulching with compost or manure, kelp, leaves, anything to be sort of keep that supply of organic matter and nutrients into your soil. And we can amend to sort of fine-tune the conditions for specific crops. So that would be the amendments that I showed earlier, the green sand and the kelp and calphos and that kind of stuff. And controlling weeds, like we just said, controlling weeds is really important, so they don't rob all the nutrients from your soil. And that can be done, like we said, with mulching or hoeing or by individually pulling them by hand. So that is about it. So we can open it up for any questions or anything now. Hopefully everybody can still hear me, and I've not been talking to myself for the last hour.
No, I think we've had some pretty attentive people here. I think we're
okay, good.
of 100 people there towards the middle.
Oh yeah.
I haven't had any questions come up now, so if anybody does have questions, in the left panel there's a Q&A and a question mark there. So if you want to go in there and just type away your question, I'll get it and say it to Tom. But maybe I had one here, just a quick note that I made. You were talking about adding lime to bring up the pH for acidic soils. Is a higher pH normal to have, or if you're above that 8.3, 8.5, how do you bring it down?
Organic matter will bring your pH down. Quite often, if you're planting potatoes or something like that, you want to have a more acidic soil. You can add peat or compost. That'll that's slightly acidic, so it'll bring your pH down. There's also what is it? I can't remember the chemical now. There is a chemical that you can add. It's a sulfate of some sort, which can be used for for making a alkaline soil a bit more acid.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So compost has a more neutral pH, and same with like a leaf mold or a leaf compost.
Yeah, they're usually kind of on the slightly acidic side. There's I can't remember the name of the acids and stuff now, but there are acids in organic matter, organic acids.
Perfect.
A peat bog is very
all right.
acidic because it's all that organic matter sitting there, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So if you have access to peat bog. All right. So we definitely got a number of questions coming in here now.
Okay.
Thoughts on goat manure?
Goat manure is excellent. You saw that my pictures of that orange soil that I had. I've got an area up in the back of my property that I dug over. Well, what I did with it was I laid a tarp down on it actually just to kill all the grass, and then the following year, what I did was I dug it up and it was just this bright orange, horrible clay-looking stuff. Like you never grow anything in that. But what I did was I dug trenches, buried goat manure, and then planted squash on top of that, and had a wicked crop of squash. So yeah, goat manure is, I reckon, some of the best manure around for your garden.
Perfect. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. No, I've heard some good stuff about that goat manure.
Yeah.
All right.
That stuff is gold if you can get it.
Yeah. All right. I got another one here. Wondering where to get garden sand.
Garden sand. The first place I would check would be Carews, probably. I think I've seen they have like a fairly coarse sand. That's where I'll go. If they don't have it, they might be able to tell you where to look.
And beach sand. I'm after hearing a couple of people ask if they can take sand from beaches.
I don't think legally you're allowed to.
Okay, all right. And
I don't know. I'd have.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, Sarah just came over and reminded me that last season we ended up getting some sand from, I think it's Butler's in Seal Cove. And they have a quarry there, and you can get all different grades of sands and rocks and different grades of gravel.
Perfect.
As well.
Right. Yeah. Sounds good. Yeah.
All right. Okay, another one there. Where do you get sand? I use coffee grounds. When is too many?
Coffee grounds. I mean, it's great. It's organic matter, right? I don't know if I'd apply it directly to my garden, just because of the carbon nitrogen ratio thing. I think it's pretty high on carbon, but they're excellent in compost. Yeah, especially if you have, if you balance them with something that's a bit higher in nitrogen.
All right. Tips for growing carrots. Maybe what kind of soil?
Yeah, carrots. They do like a fairly sandy soil. A lot of people say not to use too much nitrogen when you're growing carrots because it makes them fork. I don't know if that's really true. In my experience, it's been more like if it's too wet, they tend to fork.
Right.
Yeah, so a well-drained sandy soil is good for carrots. So that's why when I was talking about the crop rotation, in the fall before we were going to plant carrots, I actually added sand.
Right. Yeah. When should you add lime? And do you ever use eggshells for calcium?
I used to use eggshells. I used to put eggshells in my compost. I don't bother putting them straight in the garden, but I mix them in with my compost. But since I got chickens, I've been sort of baking the eggshells and crumbling them up and feeding them back to the chickens. What was the other thing? When to apply lime?
Yeah.
I would normally apply it, once the crops are out in the fall. Just apply it then with your mulch or whatever you're putting in for the winter. because you don't want to be throwing it around on your plants in the summer or something like that, right?
Right. And
Yeah.
because there's a slow release lime as well as a fast release lime. Is that correct? Or are you familiar with that?
Yeah, there's a pelletized lime, which is slower release. That's what I would use the pelleted lime rather than the powder,
Right. Right.
because you don't want to suddenly raise your pH and kind of mess with your soil chemistry. Um, yeah, something actually if you've got very acidic soil and you're trying to raise that pH and you're doing it with lime, I don't know if you remember from chemistry in school, but an acid plus a base equals salt plus water. So if you're putting a lot of lime
Mm,
into your ground, you're actually, you're creating salt.
right.
So you kind of want to add lime slowly. So a pelletized lime is going to do that because it takes time for that pellet to actually break down.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. The next one there is about garlic. Can you set garlic now or wait for the fall? And actually, I seen Gaze had spring planted garlic up on their website in the last couple of days.
Okay.
We normally plant ours in the fall. What do you know about spring garlic?
Yeah. I normally plant mine in the fall. Um, because it kind of gives it a head start and everything. But actually, this past fall, I was stuck out at work in Port aux Basques until middle of November, and I came home, and by the time I had everything ready for planting, we had snow, so I wasn't able to plant my garlic. Um, so what I did was I have a hoop house in my garden. Actually, you would have seen it in the first pictures there. Hoop house that covers two of my raised beds. So what I did was, as soon as the ground thawed out in early March, I think, um, I planted the garlic then. So at the moment it's in my hoop house, but my hoop house is going to move to different beds. I'll be growing my tomatoes and things in those other beds, and the garlic will be sitting there out in the open. So I you could plant it now, but you're going to have to wait until you can work the soil. The only reason I was able to do it early was because I had my hoop house there, and the soil was protected. It wasn't soaking wet or frozen.
Right. Yep.
So yeah, you don't want to plant garlic in soggy wet ground because I've been there and done that, and it doesn't end well.
Yeah, I know. There's a couple of backyards certainly still buried with a bit of snow and wet
Yeah,
ground that you want to make
yeah,
sure that you avoid.
yeah.
One here about the pH kits and how reliable they are for pH and nutrients.
Um,
Like the home
I,
kits. Sorry.
yeah, I've done a bit of reading and stuff on them, and the actual little kits that look like a little chemistry set with the little vial and stuff. Those those are pretty reliable. The only time I might question it is if you've got a soil that's got a strong color that might actually color the water a bit. Um, but yeah, they're pretty reliable because they're actually relying on like a chemical reaction that gives you that color. It's important to let them settle out for long enough because you shake it up and it'll be kind of muddy, and then it'll be muddy with like a little band of color in it. But you want to kind of let all that stuff settle out so you've got a nice clear band of color that you can compare with the chart. And that, I think those are reasonably accurate. You can also get like pH probes. Um, I'm not sure how much I would trust those because I've used like laboratory quality ones, and you know there's quite a lot of work that you have to do in sort of calibrating them and maintaining them and stuff to get an accurate reading. So you got like this $1,000 laboratory one that you got to do a lot of work to maintain, but one that you can go and buy in Canadian Tire that you just stick in the ground and read it. But I'm not sure I'm going to trust the $15 one over the $1,000 one. You know what I mean?
Yeah, oh yeah, for
Yeah,
sure. Yeah.
yeah. So I would stick
Um,
with the little test kits.
sure. Yeah, we have one here that we're after using a few times, and just to kind of give us a base idea for where we sit.
Yep.
Uh, all right. Would you take kelp straight from the beach and use it as mulch in the fall?
Yep. Yep. I have done. It's good to apply it actually in the fall because it kind of gives it a chance to to sort of rot down and decompose over the winter. I did make the mistake a couple of years ago of applying kelp in the spring. I mulched my garlic with kelp, and the garlic came up through the kelp, and then as the kelp dried in the sun, it shrinks. And with the garlic all growing up through it, as the kelp shrank, it pulled the garlic out of the ground.
Oh my God.
So I learned a lesson there. Don't apply kelp in the spring. Make sure to do it in the fall, as early as you can in the fall.
Right. And did you rinse the kelp, or how much rinsing, or is the salt content anything to be worried about?
No, I wouldn't worry about the salt. I mean, you need a certain amount of sodium and stuff in your soil anyways. That's one of the micronutrients there is the sodium.
Yeah.
And with the amount of rain that we get in the winter, most of that salt's going to be washed away anyhow. So yeah, I wouldn't go washing my kelp. No.
All right. So I got a message here. If you add mulch, sawdust, or wood chips to increase the carbon, it eventually breaks down and increases the nitrogen too. I'm having an issue right now where I have an overabundance of nitrogen in my greenhouse. Would I still just fix this by adding fresh sawdust or fresh mulch to eat some of the nitrogen while it's producing?
I'm not sure that. Without actually having a look at it myself, it's pretty hard to. I don't know if I wouldn't have thought that sawdust would be a source of nitrogen. I suspect there might be something else going on there, maybe.
So it's actually my question.
Okay.
We are having a problem with an excess of nitrogen. So I accidentally typed while it's producing. I meant I know that the mulch will eat some of the nitrogen while it's breaking down. So would that help solve my overabundance of nitrogen, or would it just become sort of cyclical for me and I'll sort of always have a nitrogen problem? Do you know what I mean?
Why do you think you have high nitrogen?
The chickens overwinter in the greenhouse, and so
right, yeah. Yep. Yeah, you could rake in some sawdust or something there, and that should help with that, because then that'll fix your carbon nitrogen ratio, right? You might want to sort of look up how much you would need, like estimate how much chicken manure is there, and then how much sawdust you're going to need to kind of bring it back to your ideal ratio.
Yeah.
Well, you probably want to go for more like 30-1, because you're basically you're sort of composting at that stage, right? So yeah, figure out how much sawdust you need to bring your carbon nitrogen ratio back to about 30-1.
Cool. All right, thank you. All right, I got one here. Thanks so much, Tom. I'm curious about how one establishes mycorrhizae in one's garden, or does that happen naturally as you add organic matter to your soil?
Yeah, that'll happen naturally, particularly if you're using like composted wood chips or sawdust, that kind of thing. But yeah, the fungi move around as spores, and there's billions of spores in the air landing on your garden all the time. So if the conditions are right for them, they'll get established. You can get compost that has it's inoculated with the mycorrhizal fungi. Like there's one of the premixes with mycorrhizae. So if you're sort of using that as a potting mix or whatever, and then dumping that out into your garden, or you could even add it directly to your garden, that'll certainly help inoculate your garden with some beneficial fungi. But yeah, I kind of assume that they're there all the time anyways.
Yeah, and I know I'm after reading a few times of people wondering about mushrooms coming up in their garden or around their borders, and is that a sign of healthy mycorrhizal activity or healthy soil composition?
I guess it depends a bit on what kind of mushrooms it is, but I mean it's an indicator that it's
favourable conditions for whatever kind of mushroom that is. You know, yeah, I mean, it's probably a good sign. You might start to wonder if maybe you've got a bit too much carbon in there if you're getting a lot of mushrooms popping
Right.
up. You know, it could be, you know, you got a lot of wood chips or something in there, but I wouldn't worry about it too much, anyways.
Yeah,
Unless
I
they're
know, I
something
know we did have.
poisonous.
Yeah, no, I know we had some. I'm not familiar with the species, but some pretty common mushrooms growing out of the side of the raised beds at Gateway
Right.
Garden, and I think we contributed, or I think that it was caused by we did a layer of mulch on the bottom of each bed. So just as that was
Right.
breaking down, we had some kind of creeping out through the sides of some of the boxes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, mushrooms. A lot of mushrooms, anyways, thrive in you know, decaying wood. So
Yeah.
you know, if there's that kind of stuff in your mulch, then yeah, you're gonna see mushrooms.
Yeah. All right. We are gardening rookies. We have a plot of land that was set by the previous homeowners, but it hasn't been set for at least 4 years. We plan to plant potatoes in this year. Other than turning the soil and preparing it, what else might we need?
Potatoes are certainly a good crop for if you're basically breaking new ground. Potatoes, they actually like a lot of mulch. So you know, whatever organic matter you can get your hands on, whether it's leaves or kelp or compost. Yeah, add that to your. What you can either do is you can dig trenches and then add that organic matter in the trench if it's well rotted. Plant the potatoes into that and then kind of hill them up. Or you can just, you know, once the potatoes are planted, you can mulch over the top as well. I actually did an experiment last year growing potatoes, basically just in mulch. You know, I planted them maybe an inch down in the soil, and then mulched over the top with layers of. I had some old hay, some sort of half rotted hay, and some chicken manure and some leaves. And the potatoes actually did really well in that, just basically sitting on the soil surface. And to harvest them, all I did was pull back the mulch, and there were the potatoes.
Yeah.
The only disadvantage with that method was they're more vulnerable to insects, so like slugs and carpenters tended to get at the potatoes.
Sure.
But yeah, yeah.
No shortage of those around here.
No,
certainly.
no.
And just talking about soil amendments, I have a question here just about different types of animal matter that you talk about as organic matter. So animal matter would just be the waste, or
Well, actually, you know, farms often compost like, you know, animals that die on the farm. Like, you know, you get a cow die, you can compost it.
yeah,
Yeah, there's certain things you have to do. Like, you know, you have to be pretty careful about your carbon nitrogen ratios. You have to have, you know, a lot of straw or sawdust if you're composting a whole cow. But you know, composting animals like, you know, capelin, that's good in your compost.
sure.
Yep. And obviously, yeah, animal waste like the manure and stuff is excellent in compost. But yeah, basically anything that was living or has come from something that was living, you can compost it.
All right, another one here. I have a large flower beds that we are thinking of taking out and putting in vegetables. Perennial flowers have been growing perennial flowers have been growing awesome for decades, as we have always added compost annually. Should I assume this soil would be good for vegetables?
Sounds, yeah. If they've been adding compost every year, should be pretty good. You might want to do a pH test if you've been adding compost but maybe not adding lime. It might be a bit on the acidic side. So yeah, do a pH test to make sure you're in that sort of 6.2 to 6.8 kind of range. But yeah, other than that, you should probably be good to go.
Okay. Do you dig down to make the garden? If so, how far? I guess for tilling.
And
I know
well,
you
my
must-
garden now.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, my
you
garden
did-
now
you know-
is all raised beds and pretty much no dig. I do have a garden at the back of my property, and I try not to dig down too far, because if you dig down far, you start stirring up more rocks, and you get down into the clay stuff that's down there. So I'll probably go down maybe a 6 inches, something like that. I really don't, I don't dig it all that deeply. I might go along with a fork and loosen it up. So I'll stick the fork down as far as it will go, and just kind of tilt it just to kind of loosen the soil up, let a bit of air in there. But if I'm tilling it, I don't go that deep.
Right. Have you ever used compost from Carews, and how have you found it?
I've used the triple mix from Carews, and that has their compost in it. Triple mix is excellent stuff, and it's the compost that's in it that kind of, the compost and I think it's composted fish waste and manure or something that's in it, and that's, it's excellent stuff, nutrient-wise. Stuff grows like crazy, but there does tend to be a lot of weed seeds in it, so you got to be prepared for the first couple of years after you apply it to really keep on top of those weeds, because with that amount of weed seeds and that amount of nutrients, it quickly goes from a lovely looking bed of soil to a bed full of weeds.
Right.
So that's where the weeding and the mulching and everything comes in. In my gardens, if if I top them off with triple mix or something like that, I'll definitely use a mulch, and quite often I use the synthetic mulch, because that smothers out those weeds.
Right.
Yeah.
Any tips for growing onions?
What kind of what? Sorry.
Or like this, maybe soil requirements, or any.
Just a good garden soil. I think the most important thing with onions is to start them early. If you're growing them from seed, you want to be starting them like February. Start them indoors under some good lights. Keep them well fed when they're small, and get them out as soon as the ground is workable and you're not expecting any real cold weather. They'll take a little bit of frost, but you don't want them getting snowed on too heavily or anything like that. But soil wise, if you've got a good well drained garden soil, they don't like it too wet. So maybe a slightly sandier soil, something like that. It'd be good for onions.
How do you use those hoops in your garden? So,
sorry?
Oh, sorry. Just I guess they're talking about the raised beds with looks like the PVC hoops, maybe?
Okay.
Garlic?
How about those the hoops? Those are PEX pipe. So you get it from a building supplies place, and they are cut, I think, 2 meters long and stretched across my bed, which is 4 feet wide. I'm bilingual in my units. Bed's 4 feet wide and the hoop is 2 meters long. Anyway, and then those are attached to the side of the beds with just 2 of the little tiny plumbing straps on each end.
Right.
And then I over the top I'll either put a 6mm vapor barrier to create like a little greenhouse, or I'll use the what's it called, the row cover, cover tan row cover. It's like a kind of a fleece that goes over the top. It allows the rain to fall through it, but it gives the plants a little bit of shelter. Like it retains some of the warmth overnight, and it protects them from really strong sunlight as well. So that's good if you're getting stuff sort of established early in the season. It kind of gives you an extra probably month or 3 weeks earlier that you can plant stuff if you're planting it under that.
Yeah, so it's almost like a mini greenhouse there.
Yeah. I find it particularly useful for my corn. I sow my corn direct in my garden, round about the beginning of May. But what I do is I'll put up one of those little mini greenhouses over the garden. Basically, as soon as I can get at it, like in the next in the next week or so, once the snow is gone, I'll prepare the soil, put the vapor barrier over it and weigh it down, and leave it there to kind of warm up until early in May, and then I'll be sowing my corn beginning of May. Yeah, and then that plastic will stay on until July, August, when the corn is actually kind of lifting it off. And it gives the corn enough of a start and the heat that it needs to get going, so I actually get a decent crop of corn.
Yeah, no, they certainly come in handy.
Yeah.
All right, I have one here. I have access to fine sand and a coarser sand. Which is best to use?
Probably a mix of the two. It depends what your garden soil is like. If we go back to those diagrams that I was talking about, your fine sand might be more like a silt, and the coarse sand will be more like the sand corner there. So you have to have a look at your soil. If your soil is kind of a bit slow to drain and a bit heavy, you might want to add more of the sort of coarse sand to kind of create a bit more space and have it draining better. But if it's already reasonably well drained, you don't want to make it so it dries out sort of day after a rainstorm, so then you want to maybe add the finer sand, So yeah, kind of with those diagrams in mind, think about what you need to bring your soil into that kind of sandy loam sort of area.
Right. I've got a question here that somebody has a problem with ants. Is there a certain type of soil that ants like, or is there any hints?
It's like dry soil. Yeah, if you got ants, it's usually a sign that you've got dry soil. I tend to get ants in my greenhouse and in the sort of sides of my raised beds sometimes. And that's just where you've got an area that's really dry out. Ants will get themselves established there. The best way to deal with them, really, there's poisons and things, but that'll kill them off. But you're putting poison in your garden, and if the conditions are right, more ants are going to move in later. So you want to change the conditions. So if they're there because it's dry, just make it a bit wetter. Like when you water, give that area an extra good soaking, and over time that'll put them off. Or you can get chickens.
Yeah, no, they do a good job with the ants around here.
Yeah.
All right, can you again give advantage and disadvantages of tilling the soil? I thought, among other things, tilling introduces air into the soil, mixes fertilizers, and was a good thing. Maybe I should be doing it every second or third year rather than every spring to avoid disturbing the microbe structure in the soil that you talked about. How often maybe should gardens be tilled, or would it be healthy to do it every couple of years?
Well, the reason that tilling is kind of a sort of a mainstay in gardening is, exactly like, if you take particularly like a fresh patch of ground and you till it up, it is bringing up nutrients from down below and kind of mixing everything up. But if you do it year after year, every year you do it, you're losing that advantage because you're just mixing up soil that's already been mixed up. Yeah, it is helpful for mixing in nutrients. If you're determined that you want to till, what I would recommend is minimizing the depth that you're tilling to. I've actually kind of done experiments, not on my own property, but when I worked at the organic farm, I experimented tilling just down maybe, just a couple of inches, just enough to kind of fluff things up and mix in the amendments. The advantage of that is that you get this nice fluffy soil that you can plant in, but you're not bringing up new weed seeds. So the organic farmer had a huge problem with chickweed in one of the greenhouses, and one of the best ways to grow chickweed is to till your soil, because that brings up all the new seeds and it just takes off. Once I started, minimizing the tilling, just going down sort of a couple of inches, after a couple of seasons, basically it eliminated the chickweed problem in that greenhouse. If you want to have a look in more detail at sort of no-till or no-dig gardening, Charles Dowding is kind of the guy to look up. I think he's got a website. I think it's charlesdowding.co.uk. But if you just Google Charles Dowding no dig, he's got reams and reams of really good videos on no dig, and he's got some side-by-side comparisons of no dig gardens versus a regular dug garden, and there's not a lot of difference, other than the fact that with no dig, he hasn't had to waste time digging the garden, right? He just mulches it and off you go. Whereas, with the dug garden, you're always, having to put that time and effort into digging it.
Yeah, I just finished reading a book, Jean-Martin Fortier, who's a Quebec farmer, and he talks about using a harrow, I believe it is, but he only tills to like you said, a depth of only 1 or 2 inches, just to prepare the soil for planting, and takes a lot of care to make sure that he doesn't disturb a lot of that deeper soil structure, right?
Yeah.
All right, just a couple more here. I know we're cluing in on the end. I understand the idea. Sorry.
No, I was going to say I got plenty of time. If you want to go on a bit later, I'm fine with that.
I understand the idea of carbon to nitrogen ratio. How do you determine what your ratio? How do you determine what ratio you are starting with?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess it depends a bit. If you have some experience, if you've been growing stuff in that garden, you'll have an idea of how well it's been doing. But if you're starting with like a virgin soil, it's likely to be pretty low in organic material. And if there's organic material there, it's likely to be mostly carbon. If it's a woodland soil or something like that, it's going to be high in carbon. I believe you can get it tested. I've never really looked into it. But I sort of focus on the stuff that I'm adding to my soil, get the carbon nitrogen ratio right in that, and then over time because you're always adding this material, the rest of your garden's going to kind of fall in line. The carbon and nitrogen are stuff that's sort of consumed anyways over time, right? So if you're adding stuff with the right proportions over time, it's going to bring your garden to the right proportion anyways. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Yep. There's lots of resources online that list reams and reams of different feedstocks. Whether it's horse manure, sheep manure, cow manure, wood chips, seaweed, human hair, whatever. It gives you the carbon nitrogen ratios for those. So then you can look at the carbon nitrogen ratios of the stuff that you're putting in and make sure that I guess it's most important if you're composting, make sure that you got the right amount of wood chips with your chicken manure or whatever, right, to give you that sort of 30-to-1 for your compost. Yeah.
I've heard that there's fungus in maple trees here in town that should not be in the compost. Should I find a new source of leaves?
That would be the black tar spot fungus, I think.
Yeah,
people are worried about. That's a fungus that attacks maple trees. I wouldn't apply that as a mulch around any trees that I'd be worried about, passing the fungus onto. But I'm not concerned about using it in my garden because I'm not growing maple trees. I haven't seen any issues with it, and I can't think of any reasons to worry about it unless I was mulching trees with it. If somebody knows any better than that, I would certainly like to hear it. But that's the assumption that I'm going on. It's a fungus that trees get.
And it looks like the last one there, maybe not so much about soil, but if you have any celery or leek varieties that you would recommend. It says there they haven't germinated very well for them.
The celery, I don't grow celery, but I know it's very slow to germinate, so it might just require patience. Leeks, my favorite variety is, I'm trying to remember its name now. Lancelot is a good leek. And there's another one, I think it's Megatron or something like that. Megatron or Megatron? I can't remember. Mega something.
And do you wrap your leeks, or do you cover your stems, or how, or do you build up the soil, or how is it you?
It depends how much time I've got. I typically work away now in the summers, so I'll be spending most of my summer like out on the West Coast or something like that. So I don't have a lot of time to mess with my garden. This year might be different. So yeah, if I've got the time to put in, what I'll do for my leeks is I'll dig shallow trenches, maybe 3 or 4 inches deep, and then I'll use a dibber, so like an old spade handle. The spade is cracked off or whatever, and it's sharpened to a point. I'll make holes with that in the bottom of the trench, and then I'll plant the leeks in those holes, so they're kind of at the bottom of a hole in the bottom of a trench. And then over time, with rain and just kind of working the soil, that hole fills in and then the trench fills in. So you'll end up with a longer white part of your leek. But that's a lot of messing around when there's nothing really wrong with the green parts of the leeks anyways. And different leeks have different habits too. There are some that naturally have kind of a long cylindrical white stem, and other ones that tend to be more leafy. So if you're looking for that cylindrical white stem, you're probably better off just choosing a variety that has that rather than trying to sort of force that.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's all the questions there, Tom.
Okay. Excellent.
I guess
some good questions.
On behalf of a lot of information here. I gotta try and absorb now. But on behalf of the Conception Bay South Community Garden, we'd like to thank you for the presentation. It's been very informative, and we will be posting this up online on our Facebook. So if anybody has further questions, maybe they can reach out to us, and we can help them get in contact with you or find some extra answers. But it's been excellent to have you, and thank you again.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Something I was going to ask, I can actually make this, I guess you've recorded this presentation, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Would you like to actually have a copy of the presentation itself?
Sure. Yeah, I'm sure we could make that available for anybody interested.
Okay. Yeah, I'll send you a copy of that, probably like as a PDF or something in the next couple of days.
That's excellent.
Because I can add some more stuff into my notes, and I got some references I want to put in there as well that might be useful for people.
Perfect.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, I got one person saying they'd like a copy, so I'd say that's all.
All right. Excellent. Well, I'll pass it on to you in the next couple of days. All right. No worries. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. You too.
Bye.
All right. Bye.